Hi, Mustafa.
Hi, Tom.
So today I'm with Palestinian academic and peace activist Mostafa Elostaz. We've been friends for many years. Mustafa was born and grew up in Kuwait to Palestinian parents who moved to Kuwait from Gaza, but they were originally from a town just north of Gaza in Arabic called Majd al-Ashkelon and known in Hebrew as Ashkelon. In addition to being an academic, Mustafa is also very involved with discussions with Israelis about the issues of Palestinian refugees, and also about Israelis and Palestinians knowing each other's pasts and their narratives, knowing each other's narratives. Mustafa has a doctorate from Ohio State University. He taught many years at Quds University in East Jerusalem, and he now teaches at Tel Aviv University, conflict resolution. He divides his time between Paris and Jerusalem, and he's today with us in Paris. So, Mustafa, just at the beginning, let's just talk a little bit. Tell us about your parents, their professions, your childhood in Kuwait.
Okay, thank you, Tom. I was born in Kuwait. Actually, all of my siblings were born in Kuwait. And this was as a result of my parents moving to Kuwait early on. My father was a physics teacher in Kuwait for many years until 1990. I grew up in Kuwait. I had a wonderful childhood. It was really wonderful. We had the chance to travel using our Palestinian, what was called an Egyptian travel document for Palestinian refugees. It actually made travel difficult, but it doesn't mean that we couldn't travel. We could travel with difficulty. We spent a lot of time in Egypt. My father had a farm in Egypt, so I have a lot of fond memories of the farm in Egypt. And then eventually, we just, as a result of the Gulf War of 1990, we were resettled in the United States.
That's right, isn't it? So just to remind people, Saddam Hussein, who was then the president or dictator of Iraq, invaded Kuwait, and there was a Gulf War when the Americans led a coalition to push Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. But there were consequences, weren't there, for the Palestinian population in Kuwait, because the PLO leadership, Yasser Arafat, had supported Saddam, who had invaded Kuwait. So the Kuwaiti authorities were not very happy with the PLO and sort of took it out somewhat, didn't they, on the Palestinians in Kuwait?
Actually, yeah, the invasion of Kuwait by the Iraqis in 1990 had a huge impact on the Palestinians. There was about 450,000 Palestinians in Kuwait. And today that number is reduced to, I think, less than 30,000. This has impacted a lot of the economic activities that were taking place, for example, in the West Bank and Gaza due to remittances made by Palestinians to their families in the occupied territories. So this had a huge impact. I personally say to a lot of people, that's 1990, that's when the new Middle East started. Because that's where you see that's where you see a lot of shifting of alliances.
Well, yes. I mean, there's of course, the Iraq War that happened under the younger Bush president 13 years later.
No, you mean the older president.
Sorry?
The older president.
Yes, but I mean the Iraq War that followed in 2003 maybe has its origins in 1990 with Saddam.
Very likely, very likely, yes, yes.
But by the way, just about your childhood, I remember you told me once that your father, I think he was also the physics tutor to the children of the Emir of Kuwait, and he brought you home a sword or something.
Yeah, this was actually a very interesting and I have a very fond memory of this incident. Actually, he was the tutor for several of the children of the emirs, like more than one emir. He even had a permit. It's like an ID card where he can enter the emir's palace. And one day he came home and he was holding a really, really nice sword. I remember the color of the cover of the sword. It was red. And he said, here, this is a gift for you. And I said, a sword? At the time, I remember it was even heavy. And
You didn't.
I
You
said,
didn't get in. You don't know. You didn't get in any skirmishes with your brothers or
no,
sisters.
no, 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 no.
No, no.
Not with the sword, not with
Okay.
the sword. I could barely carry it at the time. I mean, I think maybe 5 or 6. But it was a beautiful sword. So eventually we ended up using it as a decorative item.
Okay.
But it was a real sword. It was fantastic and wonderful.
Okay. Did you manage to bring that your parents when they eventually moved to America, or they didn't let that through the airport security?
As a matter of fact, well, this is the thing that so many people don't remember. All the current airport security that you think of didn't
Right.
exist at the time.
You're right. You're right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, nobody knew the invasion of Kuwait was going to happen. So this was just left behind in Kuwait. We were on summer vacation when it
Right.
happened.
Right.
I mean, I remembered I was in Egypt at the time to apply for colleges. I was 17. I just finished high school. And we applied for to apply for colleges. And I thought I'd go back to Kuwait and pick up the rest of my stuff.
Right.
Actually, a funny incident that happened, my father had some cash in Kuwait that he left for me at the apartment. And he said, Mustafa, don't bring it with you when you come to Egypt. Leave it there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, me being a smarty pants, I picked it up and I took it with me because I want to
Mm-hmm.
show off that I had a lot of cash on me. And guess what? The invasion happened, and that cash came in really handy for the family when we were in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. So, Mustafa, I remember, because we've spoken about it before, that you were in Egypt and then you thought about applying for to study in America, but originally you wanted to study medicine. You didn't
Yes.
originally want to get into political academia and so on. So tell me about your arrival in America, how it was, why you switched from medicine to political science.
Actually, it's interesting because if you notice, a lot of Palestinians want to have their kids study sciences,
Mm-hmm.
engineering, medicine, all of these things. And I actually studied as an undergrad philosophy.
Okay.
And it almost gave my father a heart attack when he heard about this. Because the first question was, what are you going to do with philosophy for a living? I mean, look at my father. He studied physics.
Mm-hmm.
But before I went to the US, actually, I went to Libya. Because one thing you have to keep in mind is the economic situation at the time. Living in the US and studying in the US is very costly.
Sure.
It's very expensive, especially for an international student. And education in Libya was pretty much for free for Palestinians. So I actually went to the US embassy. I said to my father, let's try to get a visa to the US. Okay? And he thought it was a crazy idea because at the time he lost his job. The invasion was happening. The Palestinian position almost everywhere was terrible. Excuse me. And we didn't have your normal passport. We had a travel document for Palestinian refugees. So the chances of getting a visa to the US was very slim. Okay. So we go to the embassy and things were completely different. At the time, you didn't have to pay a visa fee or any of this stuff. So we go to the embassy and we apply, and they almost refused us because of these reasons. Until my father could prove that he had some money and he is leaving the family behind in Egypt. Like it was me and him going there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, eventually the visa was approved. And then I went home and I was preparing my luggage, and my father was going like, "What are you doing?" I said, "Oh, I'm getting ready to go to the US." He goes, "Oh no, you're not going to the US. I can't afford it."
Hmm.
And I said, "What am I gonna do?" And he said, "You're going to Libya."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Libya? Are you nuts?" I mean, I remember I really fell into depression at the time, thinking I'm gonna go to Libya after having the gates to heaven. I mean, the US. Just think about this: the US compared to Libya was like it's a comparison between heaven and hell. And when I went to Libya in 1990, Libya was still under the embargo. So the situation there was pretty bad. Well, I ended up going to Libya, And I was really nervous about going there because I had the American visa on my passport, and I thought somehow it was just a crazy idea that they would just rip out the American visa out of my passport. And I ended up staying there for a few months, but things didn't work out. So I called my mother and I said, I need to speak to my father. And she said, oh, actually, he's in the US. He went to the US. Yeah. And I thought, that son of a gun. He went to the US and he sent me to Libya. Well, my father had some health issues. So I told her, listen, I cannot stay in Libya. I'm going to go to the US, even if I have to swim from the Mediterranean, cross the ocean, and get to New York. Eventually, she said, don't worry, we'll take care of things. And within a couple of weeks, after spending a few months in Libya, I just went to the US. And I ended up landing in California. I mean, even in California, this was another funny story. When I landed with immigration, they looked at my travel document. They didn't know what to do with it because it was written in Arabic and in French. And they actually sent me for further questioning. And I thought, oh my God, I'm like here, I'm at the gates of heaven, and they got to send me back to hell. Like I felt I was in purgatory. But eventually things worked out and I was released and I was allowed to enter the country.
That's right. And then, of course, you lived there for many years. You studied, you did your doctorate. I even remember you telling me quite funnily once your English teacher was apparently such a good teacher, you ended up marrying her, so your first wife. So that was a good way to learn English. But
yeah.
You know, but anyway, I tell you what, I don't want to spend too much time on your childhood. Shall we switch a little bit to Palestinian politics or the situation a bit, or maybe you want to explain how you got interested in it in the first place, because I think you did human rights work in general at the beginning or something.
Yes, actually, I wanted to actually focus my work on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but then after a while, I got really sick of it. Okay, by the time I started my master's degree in '96, the peace agreement, the Oslo Accords, were signed by the Palestinians and the Israelis. And I thought, I just want to move on. And I was always bewildered by the situation in the Arab world, the current conditions, the past conditions. How did the Arab world move into such desperate and awful conditions after being a major empire in the world historically? You know, the Islamic world was fantastic. So I got into the intellectual history of the Islamic world. And then later on, I actually got a job working for a refugee agency in Seattle. So I had the chance to work with different refugees, refugees from Ethiopia, refugees from Eritrea, refugees from all over Africa, refugees from Europe. And yes, believe it or not, there were refugees from Europe from the Kosovo War and the Bosnian-Serbian War and the breakdown of the former Yugoslavia. And they were actually Afghani refugees. So
from the Soviet, at that time from the Russians, probably.
Yes. And then funny enough, I dealt with some Iraqi refugees. And this was as a result of the 1991 war that happened between Iraq and the United States. And a lot of these soldiers from the Iraqi army, after they surrendered, they kind of brought in their families and they were kept in Saudi Arabia for so many years in very isolated and terrible conditions. And eventually they were approved to move to the US as refugees. So I had this constant connection. Funny enough, in all of these years, I've never encountered in my work with refugees in the US a Palestinian refugee. Okay, because it turns out the Palestinians were excluded for the Refugee Convention.
Well, they're counted under UNRWA, right, instead of UNHCR.
They were actually under UNRWA protection and not the Refugee Convention protection. So a Palestinian refugee could not claim refugeehood in the United States.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway, you know what, let's just, because I don't want to spend too long, let's just, I know you've done lots of work over the years. You're involved with something called the Geneva Initiative in, I think it was 2003. You were one of the people working on the working groups to do with Palestinian refugees. Before we get to that, let's just look from a point of view today at the state of Palestinian politics. First of all, since it happened recently, what do you think of the agreement that Israel, under the Likud, that is the right-leaning government of Benjamin Netanyahu, has made with the United Arab Emirates? And that agreement is in the context of what was released earlier this year by the Trump administration, which is being called the Trump Plan for Israel and Palestine. So what do you think of the Israel-UAE agreement and the Trump Plan?
Well, I mean, these two are separate questions. The UAE-Israel agreement it's a good agreement. I haven't seen the details of it, but due to my own beliefs, any move towards peace is good. Now, the question is, where does this leave the Arab Peace Initiative? Because the Arab Peace Initiative that came out several years ago, there was
the one from Saudi Arabia in about 2002 or something.
Yes,
I think. Yeah.
It was a Saudi proposal, which was exchanged for peace and normalization in terms of for 1967 borders. Now, I don't see any of this happening in terms of the agreement with the United Arab Emirates. I mean, states can agree on whatever terms they want. That's up to them. Okay. I don't have either a positive or a negative reaction to the agreement. I think it's good that they have peace between the countries, because we really don't need to spend all of the resources on wars and conflict.
Is it possible, because they're going to be direct flights from Dubai, Abu Dhabi to Tel Aviv, is it possible that a certain segment of the Israeli population, they're not hostile to Palestinians, but they're a bit frightened, or they don't even know Arabs very well. And therefore, if, as I understand, or I read in the press, quite a lot of visitors, Emiratis, will come to Israel, even this little thing will maybe make some Israelis more comfortable with meeting Arabs. I mean, one of the problems in recent years is that there's very little interaction. Paradoxically, before the Oslo peace process, there was much more interaction between Israelis and Palestinians. Israelis, I don't know, went to shopping markets in Gaza and the West Bank, and Palestinians might have gone to the beach or something near Tel Aviv. And today, there's much less interaction by most people.
Yes.
So the humanization that goes with interaction, even if it's with Emiratis, is a positive thing, I would think.
Well, that is an important issue and an important question. There is a peace agreement. Is there going to be normalization taking place between the nations? I mean, there is a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. There is a peace agreement between Jordan and Israel. Is there normalization between the citizens of these countries?
There's
and
not,
usually
yeah.
there isn't, and there isn't, and this is what we really don't know yet. Okay.
It may be different though with Gulf Arab populations who are not don't share a border with Israel, and it also depends on the leadership. I mean, the leadership in Egypt in particular, they have security cooperation with Israel, but they haven't exactly fostered a sense of, goodwill, and maybe vice versa from Israel too. So it's not, but let me ask you just something. The Palestinian leadership, the Palestinian Authority, has out of hand rejected the UAE-Israel agreement, saying the UAE are traitors, and if they come to Jerusalem, they won't be allowed onto the Al-Aqsa Mosque to visit. And they've also, Trump produced a very detailed plan. It may not be to the satisfaction of the Palestinians, but it's nevertheless an incredibly detailed working plan, do you think it would be better of the Palestinian Authority to say, well, we're not accepting this plan, but we will sit with you and talk about it and go through it with you and point out all the things that we think we would like changed? In other words, negotiate. Because at the moment, the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority, essentially, as far as we're aware, just refuses to negotiate and they just condemn. Is it in the best interests of the cause of peace or improving the situation for Palestinians not to engage with United States and Israel? And indeed, in a way, you have to make peace with your enemy. So here you have a Republican President, Trump, and a Likud Prime Minister, Netanyahu, who want to sit and talk. So, you make peace with one's enemy. Is it a mistake? I think it is of the Palestinian Authority to not negotiate.
Well, I don't want to say whether it's a mistake or not. I do think the Palestinians could use this as an opportunity to speak to the Emiratis to create some leverage, to create some basic steps for negotiations with Israel, especially if the Israelis are going to benefit from this peace agreement with the Israelis. Okay? Peace agreements are meant to actually benefit both sides, not only one side over the other. So if there is anything for the Israelis to gain from the Emiratis, the Palestinians should actually get involved in this and start speaking to the Emiratis about what they would like to happen in terms of their own position. And I don't see this as happening today. Okay? With the peace agreement, I mean, if you notice, when Israel talked about the annexation of the Jordan Valley, many people, even though people think of it as a Palestinian territory, part of the West Bank, many Israelis were concerned about the impact of this with the relationships with Jordan, how this will affect the relationship with Jordan. So there is probably an opportunity for the Palestinians to actually start speaking to the Emiratis rather than just flat out rejecting this agreement.
But I mean,
because one comment I made actually at one point, if you're going to reject this agreement, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the French, the Egyptians, the Jordanians have all peace agreements. They have agreements with the Israelis. They recognize the state of Israel. So are we going to start just rejecting these agreements and these recognitions like we're doing with the Emiratis?
I mean, do you think it was a mistake? I mean, the Emiratis, after all, is only one country and it's not such a powerful country. But in the past, Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, under the auspices of American President Bill Clinton, offered the Palestinians a state, both in Camp David and afterwards in Taba. And a few years later, another Israeli Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, from the centrist Kadima party, with the aid of Condoleezza Rice and George W. Bush, also offered the Palestinians a state. And maybe that offer wasn't enough for the Palestinians to accept. But was it a mistake not to, take it up, to try and work further with it? Because if the Ehud Barak offer was 20 years ago, in the year 2000, I mean, there'd been a lot of bloodshed and hardship in the last 20 years. And indeed, the Hamas-Fatah rift that we now see very badly was not so marked. 20 years ago, it wasn't. Hamas weren't so strong. They didn't rule in Gaza and so on. So in retrospect, I think it was probably a mistake, but I don't know. What do you think? I mean, a mistake of the Palestinians not to accept it.
I mean, well, hindsight is 2020. Was it a mistake? I really don't know. I've heard people say it was a mistake. I've heard some people say, no, it was not a mistake. I even saw an interview with Dennis Ross where he says, no, they shouldn't have accepted. If he were in the Palestinian position, he wouldn't have accepted what was offered to him.
Just in case someone doesn't know, Dennis Ross was a long-time American peace negotiator who's worked for Democrats and Republican presidents.
Yes. There is always, I mean, here's the thing. One thing you have to think about. When an Israeli is going to go visit the UAE, they're probably going to go through the customs and the passports, and they're going to just probably just pass through. Is this going to be the case for an Emirati passing through Israeli airports? I mean, today, even as a Palestinian American, when I go through the Israeli passports, I'm held up. Okay, it doesn't matter that I have an American passport. Okay, do we know what kind of restrictions, what kind of regulations, what kind of rules were going to happen with this offer? We don't really know. I think sometimes it's futile to say it's a mistake. The past is past, it's finished.
No. Okay, well, let's look again at today. So again, you have now a fairly hardline American president, Donald Trump, and a fairly hardline Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu. The advantage of negotiating with hardliners, as we've seen in other conflicts, you know, Nixon in China, Reagan and the Soviets,
yes,
de Gaulle in Algeria, Nixon and Mao, I meant. There are many cases, anyway, historically. In fact, Menachem Begin, who was a hardliner, and Egypt.
With Egypt, yes.
So there's an advantage it's easier in a way to make peace with a tough guy, a nationalist like Netanyahu or Trump, because if you agree to something, it's likely to be held up without that much opposition within Israel, because Netanyahu can take on the hard right in Israel, as opposed to a more left-wing government that might not be able to sell to Israelis the concessions that Israel would have to make. So in a way, I think that some of the friends of the Palestinians among non-Palestinians, including Jewish ones in New York or London, who say, wait out Trump, wait for some better condition, wait till Netanyahu's out of office, wait till Trump's out of office. It's a mistake. I don't know really if there'll be better circumstances or conditions. And I would have thought, seize the opportunity and take up Trump on his proposal and see if he's serious about wanting to make peace. That's what I would do if I was the Palestinian Authority.
I mean, don't forget that what Trump offers is completely different for what was being dealt with for the past 25
no, it's
20
much
years.
Worse. I get it, but it's still a start. You can raise that at the negotiations, but there has to be negotiations.
There have to be negotiations, but if these negotiations don't lead to what Trump wants and his team, this will probably lead to the failure of the negotiations. And why should the Palestinians go and negotiate for less and less sovereignty and control? I mean, according to the Trump plan, the Palestinians will have no control over entries or exits to their own territory. I mean, I've talked to Israelis who actually think the Trump plan would be a nightmare for Israel itself.
I don't think that anyone, even Kushner and the people involved in the plan, think this is the end of the matter. It is, and I think you even said it to me, it's a kind of negotiating starting point. I don't think anyone, including Netanyahu, I don't think anyone thinks it's a take it or leave it end of the story. It's a plan that's been produced to go through point by point to raise objections to things that the Palestinians don't agree with and put counter proposals for those things.
I agree. I think the Palestinians,
by not even negotiating, I'm not sure how that's advancing the the situation for Palestinians.
Well, I think the Palestinians should speak to the Israelis and try to reach an agreement on so many different points. And I am sure there are agreements on certain issues. Okay. Is it useless not to speak? Yeah, I agree. It's useless. Maybe they should actually start holding meetings and negotiations where they can create meeting points and agreements of what is agreeable, and then you just take it off the table. This is agreeable. It's finished. Let's move on to the more difficult issues.
So, Mustafa, just because we haven't got so much time, but just a couple of other questions. You have dealt a lot with refugees. Just very briefly, you've told me before, but for everybody else, you came up with 5 or 6 different criteria for the millions of Palestinian refugees. If there's eventually an agreement with Israel, just outline what those criteria are and for each.
Okay. I think actually most people tell you Jerusalem is the most difficult issue. I think it's refugees. And the Geneva Initiative was a model agreement that was created in around 2003. And don't forget, this was done during the almost the middle of the second Intifada. This was one of the bloodiest times between Palestinian and Israelis. Suicide bombings were happening. Incursions by Israel and invasion of the West Bank happened. This was after the signing of the Oslo Accords. Okay, so this was a very difficult time for both nations. And yet, Palestinian and Israelis were able to reach a model agreement on the core issues of the conflict. And one of these core issues was refugees. By the way, they also had an agreement on Jerusalem too.
But you know, we don't have time for everything.
Jerusalem,
so just outline the refugee. Yeah.
No, the refugee is actually creates different criteria for what will happen with refugees. And by the way, we shouldn't forget, refugees have the ultimate choice on what they want. Okay, this is under international law, so we don't violate the rights of refugees. But what was proposed in the agreement was the following. First is refugees have the right to stay in the host countries, and this is Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, wherever they are covered under UNRWA. Second option is moving back to Israel under certain conditions, which is, don't forget the agreement, the text that's mentioned in the United Nations charters is going back to their homes. It doesn't talk about a state, it talks about homes. And this means going back to their villages, okay, or cities or towns. And then number three is actually moving to Palestine, the newly founded state of Palestine. Number four is actually going to third countries that are willing to take some of these refugees, and this will be some European countries, some Arab states, the United States maybe, Canada maybe, Latin America, or actually move to some of the areas that will be included in the land swaps that would happen between Palestine and Israel, and these would be the areas that were designated for Palestine.
So just in case anyone doesn't know, under successive negotiations and also under the Trump plan, the idea is that the Israeli settlement blocks, in other words, large Israeli populations close to the Green Line, close to the Israeli border, would be incorporated into Israel, and the same amount of territory will be taken out of Israel into the new Palestine. So in the Trump plan, which is rather radical compared to the previous plans, quite a lot of territory in the western Negev desert in Israel, which is by Gaza. So Gaza's territory would expand. There'd be room to create entire new cities there, in fact, because it's uninhabited territory. So you could build industrial parks and cities. I think that's what they were talking about in the Trump plan.
Yeah, but don't forget, actually, this will cost a lot of money too. And
sure.
There was the proposal of the 50 billion that will be injected into Palestinian economy, but this was not free money or grants. I mean, a lot of this was actually loans, which we can't guarantee it will work out.
I mean, Mustafa, can I just ask you two more questions? But first of all, on Palestine and then on your career. Without going into the rights and wrongs of the plight of the Palestinian people, there are, of course, hundreds of peoples around the world in dire circumstance. We have, for example, the Rohingya, 800,000 yes. Muslims pushed out in an ethnic cleansing campaign a year or two ago by the Burmese government, and they're in appalling conditions. Terrible, terrible, no one's helping them. And then you have all kinds of conflicts that people never pay attention to. Baluchis, you have refugees within Iraq, Christians, Kurds, and so on. You have all over Africa conflicts, you have in Central Asia, you have indigenous peoples in Latin America, and so on. Is there a danger for the Palestinians that by not accepting, albeit much less than they might want, the rest of the world, and most importantly the Arab world, will get tired of the Palestinian issue, and it will become what has been described as Northern Cyprus? What do I mean by Northern Cyprus? Turkey invaded a European Union country, Cyprus. They pushed the Greeks out of part of Cyprus into the Greek part, out of the Turkish to the Greek part, and they brought in about 40,000 Turkish settlers. And even though Cyprus is a member of the European Union, no one ever talks about it, no one mentions it, no governments. The danger for the Palestinians is the world will move on and people will just forget about them. And after all, Israel, when it was founded, Ben-Gurion agreed to a state without the old city of Jerusalem with the holiest Jewish sites and so on. So other peoples who want states like the Kurds or the Tibetans in China or the Chechens in Russia and many others, if I think the Tibetans were offered a state on less than they wanted, they'd probably grab it. So the danger for the Palestinians is, as you rightly say, it will cost a lot of money, but 50 billion that was on the Trump plan is still quite a lot of an offer, but we may be about to go into a worldwide economic depression because of the coronavirus pandemic, which we're now under. There's a risk that, let's say Trump loses and Biden comes in, let's say Netanyahu's replaced by a more moderate Israeli leader, it doesn't mean there'll be any international efforts. They're all busy with their own problems. If I would take what you can, that's what I would do.
I'm not, by the way, I agree with you. It's not only that the world will move on, and this is not going to happen in the future.
Yeah.
It has already happened.
But it's going to happen even more, is what I mean.
Yes. I mean, to tell you the truth, I think this started to happen where people, I've heard it from many different diplomats.
Yeah.
Where they would tell me, frankly, we are tired of your conflict. This has started happening with the Arab Spring. I mean, the Arab Spring was such a major event. Mm-hmm. That it overshadowed the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I've heard Arabs, actually, who are very active within their own states, tell me, you know what, we're just tired of your conflict, okay? So is there a danger to this? Absolutely. I think it will happen, and eventually, my biggest fear is that the Palestinians will just be left behind. Mm-hmm. And it's becoming more of a nuisance than a real human rights and a human disaster. Mm-hmm. So I've asked actually quite a few people, what is more important to you? A state or a life with dignity? Okay, and I'm talking about Palestinians.
And the answer?
We all say life with dignity. Okay? So even this issue of statehood will become very irrelevant as time passes by. Now, who is it up to resolve this issue? I think it's up to the Palestinians to actually start taking active steps to create the conditions where it becomes necessary for the establishment of a Palestinian state. So even for Israelis, I mean, they could become such a disaster for the Israelis that the Israelis will say, you know what, you want your state, here is your state, we recognize it.
Or do you mean, I mean, look, for example, Gaza, where Israel left 15 years ago, Israel, there are no more Israeli people living there or soldiers, and Hamas have put much more energy into what they call resistance, i.e. military planning, than state building. Now, of course, there are various difficulties for them, but nevertheless, that's 15 wasted years. They could have created a better economy and they wouldn't be all this border tension with Israel.
Don't forget, Tom, don't forget Gaza is actually surrounded and very restricted by the Israelis and the Egyptians.
Sure, but that's the result of lots of rocket attacks and armed attacks. If they were engaged in state building, the borders wouldn't be so strict. There wouldn't be a need for strict borders. If they put their energy... Sorry?
Why don't we flip this whole equation up on its head? What if Israel decides, you know, or starts opening up Gaza and say, listen, we'll help you with electricity, we'll help you with energy, we'll help you with freedom of movement. However, the punishment will be severe.
Well, I think that's what they have said and done.
But they haven't done it, actually. I mean, think about, for example, the fishing in Gaza. They're very restricted. And
No,
this is
no,
a major source of income
there
for
are
them.
lots of restrictions because of the attitude of the Hamas government. But I know when Israel first withdrew, and for example, Israel provided a lot of pipes for a better sewage network in Gaza, and Hamas used some of the pipes and they turned them into rockets to fire back at Israeli civilians. So, you know, it's
Yeah,
not.
but don't forget when Gaza, I mean, we all can get involved in this
Mm,
blame game. I mean, Gaza, Israel left Gaza unilaterally
sure.
without any kind of coordination with the Palestinians or anything. So it left Gaza wide open for a lot of problems.
Yes, but the
Okay.
point I'm making is that even under difficult circumstances, many countries, including Israel, have engaged in state building to create, you know, better lives for their citizens. Even under difficult circumstances, the Hamas government could have spent more energy in positive state building. They do have some resources. There is human capital and a middle class, educated middle class. They could have, they're a resistance movement. You know, they're more interested in resistance and keeping a war going on with Israel than in maybe improving the lives of Gazans. That's my impression anyway.
Sure, sure. But don't forget, when you are in a very restricted place, you run out of options.
Well, you make do with what you can do. There are many populations in the world in difficult situations.
Definitely. I
You know,
agree with you.
it's not, Gaza's not the, you know, there are many. Look, just one final question, because we're almost out of time. You teach now in Tel Aviv University, which is, of course, you know, Tel Aviv is a very Israeli city. You live in Jerusalem, which is a mixed city with both Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian Arab populations. You previously taught at Al-Quds College, which is a mainly Palestinian university in the eastern part of Jerusalem. So my question is, why did you leave Al-Quds? How is it to teach now in Tel Aviv?
It's very interesting. I actually was invited to give a talk at Hebrew University on the issues of reconciliation. I was actually invited by the Swiss ambassador to Tel Aviv. And then there was a video that was being made of the talk. And they asked me, do you mind if we record it? And I had absolute faith in the fact that my students are open-minded and Palestinians are open-minded, and this will not be objected to, especially as a person who teaches human rights. Eventually, the video of my talk was leaked to the college students and to the college.
This is at Al-Quds.
Yes, this was leaked to the to students at Quds University, and as a result of the talk that I gave, the video of the talk was actually edited, and then it was kind of trimmed, and it was manipulated, and it was leaked to students, and several student demonstrations took place where my presence there became almost impossible. Students would show up and try to disrupt the classes. The student demonstrations would happen. This led to a boycott, and they actually demanded that it was very, very Stalinist movement-like. It was very surreal, where they demanded an apology for all the statements, and they asked me to withdraw from everything I've said. They also asked me to withdraw from the Geneva Initiative. And to actually, this was the shocking part for me. The document which I can send you, which requested that I call for the liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea. Of course, I refuse to answer any of these calls.
Just in case people don't follow the issue so closely, that is a kind of phrase meaning for the destruction of Israel from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. That's what they wanted you to sign. In other words,
well, they didn't recognize. They don't want me to recognize a two-state solution. They just wanted a one state. It's called Palestine, and I refuse to recognize this as a professor of human rights and international law. Okay, of course, actually, the administration supported the students, both of Al-Quds University and Al-Quds Bard College. They provided no support for me, and they actually asked me not to be present on campus. And eventually, my contract was not renewed. And I suspect this was the reason for this.
Just to be clear, in case people don't know, Bard College, which is a liberal arts college in the United States, actually with quite a lot of kind of left-wing Jewish involvement, sponsors some of the classes at the Palestinian Quds University, and you were partly affiliated with Bard as well as Quds, and instead of sticking by you for freedom of speech, they in effect stood by the reactionaries and the hardliners who wanted to force you out of Quds.
Yes, I
That was
received
very wrong
absolutely,
of Bard.
I received absolutely no support, not even a phone call from the administration of Bard College or Al-Quds Bard, except for the dean, of course, who was concerned. Because at one point I was followed on the streets by me and my daughter, my 13-year-old daughter, by students from the college, and nothing was done about this, actually.
That can be quite intimidatory, because I know that Islamic Jihad and Hamas have student factions at the university, and they can be aggressive.
Well, those were not the people who were aggressive against me, actually. Surprisingly, it was mostly the Fatah guys.
Okay, well, okay.
Which actually goes against the PA standing. One of the things I said to them, why don't you actually go and protest the PA itself that has security coordination at the time with Israel? Plus, there is nothing that I said in my talk at Hebrew University, at Hebrew University, which I can forward it to you, and you probably have seen.
I've seen it before.
Yeah, and there was nothing wrong with it. I don't see anything wrong with it.
No, horrible. And of course, I met your lovely daughter once when we met in Europe on one occasion. She was with you and everything. Look, we had a nice lunch in Tel Aviv last year after you've been teaching there, and I was there at the time. So I hope we'll see each other again soon in person once this virus situation has cleared up. But thank you very much for being with me today. It's been very, very interesting.
Thank you so much, Tom. It has been a pleasure. Stay safe.
You too. Bye.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.